It is a sparkling but cold day, so we're going to take advantage of the weather and start lifting our dahlia tubers. In previous years, we have waited for the frost to really knock our dahlias down and all the foliage to go black. However, it's getting later and later every year, and the risk is if you hang on too long, the ground can get really wet and that can rot your dahlia tubers before you have a chance to lift them. Really up to you. If you want to hang on to the last of the flowers for a bit longer and it's fairly dry where you are, then go ahead and leave them. We'll record the videos for you now and pop them on highlights, and then once you're ready to lift your own tubers, you can just play them back whenever you like. So first things first, what we're going to do is we're going to cut the dahlia foliage down so that we can take off Neil's hoops, and then the hoops will be stored in the middle of the garden, a bit like a Turner Prize winning sculpture, bit of winter interest. Now you can see I have got a few flowers and I will try and rescue some of them. However, the cold weather is really getting to them. Look at this one here, the stems are just snapping when you try and pick them. So although they look really pretty, they're not really doing very much for us anymore. Neil's gone out quite far with the fork to start with because we don't know where the tuber is and we don't want to spear it if we can possibly help it. God, that looks healthy, doesn't it? Wowzers. Lovely, I'll take that. Another benefit of lifting them now is you can still see which dahlia is which and write a new label. They had labels, but just like socks in a washing machine, they seem to vanish, don't they? Anyway, there's a new label for it. I'm going to dry our dahlia tubers off in the polytunnel. You can use your greenhouse. Just make sure wherever you dry them off, it's well ventilated. If you use a shed, make sure you leave the door open, otherwise it will overheat. You can use a garage. If you've only got a concrete floor on the garage, I'd probably put a piece of wood or cardboard underneath your dahlia tuber so it's not sitting on a freezing surface. So I'm just going to turn my tuber upside down because the old stalks are often hollow. So we want the water to drain away, and I'll keep turning these every couple of days to make sure they dry evenly. If you store them before you dry them, then you might find that they rot because they'll never dry out in a box. Just remembered, we've got those pot dahlias that we tipped out well over a week ago now, so they're dry and they've been put into storage. So I'm going to grab one to show you now. Lots of questions have been coming through about leaving pot dahlias in their pots over the winter. Now in previous years I've said that's absolutely fine to do that. However, the last 2 years running have been very wet. Last year was a very wet autumn and this year's been wet really all year. So my advice would probably be to tip them out and give them a check over, give them a once over, because they could be damaged, in which case they're not going to store, and you're probably going to want to know that sooner rather than later so that you can arrange to get a replacement. Now, every year is different. This is Neil's shed. Can you see it's got a tin roof, which means it doesn't overheat. Every year is different, which is the beauty of the grow along, because it means that we can adapt our advice to go with the current conditions. Spin you around so you can see on the very top shelf, this is where we keep all our canes, and they last us so much longer for years and years and years if you keep them out of the winter weather. And down here, these are our storage crates. You can see the dahlias are now dry. I'll take one out in a second to show you. But because they've got their individual bags, we can put, and they're dry, we can put them all together in the same crate, which means it really, really saves on storage space. Can you imagine how much room we would need otherwise? Okay, so this one is totally tangerine. They make really good tubers. These are fantastic for pots. It's got its label in the bag, and you can see we've not knocked off all of the compost because that does actually help give it a little bit of protection over the winter so it doesn't dry out too much. And as the dahlia starts to dry, these little fingers will shrink slightly. Now the trick is to let them dry out too much. Now the bag actually adds a little bit of humidity around the tuber, which helps protect it over the winter, as does that bit of soil. Most of that soil will drop off, So we won't even attempt to divide the dahlia tubers until the spring, because now as the tubers dry out a little bit over the winter, these fingers here will start to shrink slightly, meaning it is much easier to divide them come springtime. And you'll find that they're only actually connected in certain places. The reason it is so difficult at this time of the year is because they are so fat and full of water. They have grown intertwined with each other and then they're jammed. So you'll end up destroying and ripping your dahlia tuber apart if you try and divide them when you first dig them up. By contrast, can you see how firm and fat these tubers are? And you can see how they're interlinked. It would be very difficult to try and divide this, and they are very brittle. For example, this is a small weld. Yesterday I went to pick it up and a whole piece just snapped off in my hand because they're so brittle, because they're so full of water. So you're much better off leaving them to the spring. It's easier to look after and label everything when they're kept together as a clump. Leave them to the spring, inspect the tuber then. Anything small we will take a cutting from, anything big we can divide. You can see I'm using the red bags to hang in the polytunnel here. This is a new tuber to me, so this is the same tubers that we sent out to you. Look how much it's grown over the course of the season. So I probably won't divide this one in the spring because you're going to get a better display from a larger clump. But what we can do is we can earmark this one for cuttings. It's like a Turner Prize exhibit. Bit of winter interest for us. The birds love it actually. It's like a little aviary. We should hang some bird feeders from it now. He said he's put these canes in because it stops them from blowing off. It's clever, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought of that. Would have come out and they would have been all over the lawn.
You don't have a brain.
How rude! I'm not washing your pants anymore. So to recap, we are lifting our dahlia tubers, and before storing them we are allowing them to dry out for at least a week in a well ventilated location. We're going to store our dahlias in a frost free location over the winter. Beware of garden sheds that have felt roofs because they overheat. If the door is closed, even at this time of the year, even in February, the temperature inside the shed, you'll know when you go in there to get some pots and it's been closed all day, the heat hits you. So you don't want to be storing your dahlia tubers in there. Leave your dahlia tubers in pots out in the weather all winter, because what will happen is the pots will get really wet and plants are much more vulnerable in containers than they are actually in the ground. The ground is warmer than the pots, so you need to be even more careful if they're in a pot than if you left them in the garden. We're going to overwinter some of our dahlia tubers in the ground, so we will come back and show you that later. Don't do that year after year after year. You'll probably notice yourself, if you've had a dahlia in the ground for a while, some varieties are better than others, but if you've had your dahlia in the ground for a few years, you'll probably find that it's not a patch on what it once was as far as flowering is concerned. And something like a cafe au lait, it could be the size of a small car. So you really need to lift them, otherwise they'll just get congested. You'll get loads of foliage, but not very many flowers.